When the renowned opera coach asked Whitney to hit notes that no church girl could reach, she smiled and said 5 words that changed classical music forever. Let me show you something. If you're enjoying this incredible story of musical genius, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales from music history. It was March 1984, Manhattan's Upper East Side, in Clive Davis's penthouse apartment. The gathering was one of those exclusive industry parties where classical musicians mixed with pop stars, where Juilliard professors debated vocal technique with R&B producers. About 30 people filled the elegant space, engaging in heated musical debates. Near the grand piano, a jazz vocalist demonstrated scat patterns. By the windows, a classical cellist explained why pop music lacked sophistication. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and intellectual pretension. Whitney Houston sat quietly on a cream-colored sofa near the back of the room, nursing a glass of white wine and observing the conversation swirling around her. At 21, she was still relatively unknown outside of Newark's gospel circles, though Clive had just signed her to Arista Records 3 months earlier. Her self-titled debut album wouldn't be released for another year, but those who'd heard her sing in the studio knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. She wore a simple black dress and minimal makeup, her natural beauty needing no enhancement. But it wasn't her appearance that made her remarkable. It was the voice that had been stopping people in their tracks since she was 11 years old, singing in the New Hope Baptist Church choir under her mother Sissy's watchful guidance. But tonight, she was content to listen and learn, to absorb the musical philosophy of people who'd spent decades mastering their craft in ways completely different from her own church-based education. That's when Helena Morrison arrived. Helena was 52 years old and arguably the most respected vocal coach on the East Coast. She'd trained Metropolitan Opera stars and Grammy-winning classical singers. Her studio on West 57th Street charged $500 per lesson with a 6-month waiting list. She studied at Juilliard, then in Milan, accumulating degrees that covered her office wall. Helena approached singing like a scientist. Every note had a purpose, every technique systematically learned. She believed great singing required disciplined study, that natural talent meant nothing without proper technical foundation. She'd arrived late, directly from a master class at Lincoln Center, carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any room. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore the kind of understated jewelry that suggested serious money and serious education. The conversations quieted slightly when she entered, recognizing her reputation. Helena moved through the room, greeting colleagues, discussing upcoming recitals and debating the relative merits of various European vocal traditions. She eventually settled near the piano, where several people had gathered to discuss the differences between classical and popular vocal techniques. The problem with contemporary music, Helena was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades teaching the world's best singers, is that it prioritizes emotion over technique. These pop singers, these church singers, they feel their way through songs without understanding the anatomical principles that create sustainable vocal production. Several people nodded thoughtfully. Helena continued, warming to her favorite subject. I can teach anyone to sing properly with enough time and dedication. But these gospel singers, these R&B artists, they develop bad habits early that become almost impossible to correct. They oversing, they strain their instruments. They have no concept of breath support or resonance placement. It might sound impressive to untrained ears, but it's not sustainable, and it's certainly not sophisticated. Whitney looked up from her wine glass, listening with interest but not defensiveness. She'd heard similar criticisms before, usually from people who'd never set foot in a black church, who'd never experienced the spiritual power that drove gospel vocals, who mistook passionate expression for technical ignorance. Take these melismatic runs that are so popular in black church music, Helena continued. They sound complicated, but they're actually quite simple once you understand that they're just emotional embellishments without harmonic sophistication. Any trained singer could do them with a few weeks of practice. The room had gotten quieter now, conversations trailing off as people sensed something building. Clive Davis, who'd been talking with a jazz producer near the window, glanced over with interest. He knew Whitney was in the room, and he knew what she was capable of, but he also knew she rarely spoke up in these kinds of gatherings. I've heard some of these church singers attempt classical pieces, Helena said, accepting a glass of wine from someone nearby. The emotion is there, certainly, but the technical foundation is completely inadequate. They simply don't have the training necessary to handle the demands of sophisticated vocal literature. Whitney set down her wine glass and stood up slowly. She walked toward the piano with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own body, despite being the youngest person in the room by at least 10 years. The conversation stopped entirely now, everyone sensing that something was about to happen. "Excuse me," Whitney said quietly, her voice carrying the soft, warm tones of someone raised in the South. "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about vocal technique." Helena turned toward her with polite interest, taking in Whitney's youth and casual appearance, clearly not recognizing her as anyone significant. "Yes? I was wondering," Whitney continued, her tone remaining gentle and respectful, "what you consider the most challenging technical aspect of classical singing." Helena smiled slightly, pleased to have found someone interested in serious vocal discussion. "Well, there are several elements, but I'd say the most demanding is maintaining consistent tone quality and pitch accuracy across a wide range, particularly when executing large interval jumps. Most singers, even trained ones, struggle to maintain their technique when moving through multiple octaves." "How many octaves?" Whitney asked, genuinely curious. "A truly skilled soprano should be able to navigate cleanly through at least 3 octaves," Helena said with the confidence of someone stating an established fact. "But that requires years of proper training to develop the breath support and resonance placement necessary to maintain tone quality throughout the entire range." Whitney nodded thoughtfully. "Would you mind demonstrating?" Helena looked pleased by the request. She moved to the piano, found middle C, and began a carefully controlled scale that moved methodically upward. Her technique was flawless, each note perfectly placed and supported, demonstrating the kind of disciplined training that had made her reputation. She reached the top of her range, sustained a beautiful high note for several seconds, then descended with the same methodical precision. The room applauded appreciatively. Helena's demonstration was technically perfect, showcasing decades of training and absolute mastery of classical vocal principles. "That was beautiful," Whitney said sincerely. "Your technique is incredible." "Thank you," Helena replied, clearly pleased. "It takes years to develop that kind of control and consistency." Whitney moved closer to the piano. "I grew up singing in church," she said conversationally. "We probably learn things differently than you did in formal training." Helena nodded with the kind of polite interest she might show toward folk music or other amateur traditions. "Church music has its place, certainly. Lots of passion and emotional expression, but it's quite different from serious vocal study." "I'm curious," Whitney said, her voice still gentle but carrying something that made Clive Davis stop his conversation and move closer. "Could I try that exercise?" Helena looked slightly surprised. "The 3-octave range? It's quite challenging without proper training. You might strain your voice attempting something you haven't prepared for systematically." Whitney smiled, an expression that held no challenge or defensiveness, just quiet confidence. "I'll be careful." She moved to the piano and found the starting note Helena had used, middle C, but instead of beginning immediately, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them, there was something different in her expression, a kind of peaceful focus that suggested she was drawing from sources Helena had never accessed. Whitney placed her hand lightly on the piano and began to sing. The first note emerged with a warmth and richness that immediately distinguished it from Helena's more controlled classical tone. It wasn't just technically perfect, it carried emotion, history, the weight of generations of voices that had sung in small churches and big revivals, voices that had transformed pain into hope through the alchemy of sound. As Whitney moved up the scale, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of the methodical progression Helena had demonstrated, Whitney began to weave the notes together with the kind of melismatic runs that she'd learned at her mother's side, but executed with a precision that revealed complete mastery of every technical principle Helena had mentioned. The room fell completely silent as Whitney's voice soared through the first octave, then the second, each note not just perfectly pitched, but invested with emotional meaning that transformed a technical exercise into something approaching prayer. Her breath support was flawless, her resonance placement instinctive, her intonation absolutely perfect. But she wasn't finished. As Whitney approached the third octave, where most singers would begin to show strain, her voice seemed to open up even more. The notes flowed with impossible ease, each one more beautiful than the last, building towards something that transcended everything Helena understood about vocal production. When Whitney reached what should have been the top of the exercise, the note that Helena had sustained so beautifully, she didn't stop. Instead, she continued climbing, her voice moving into ranges that Helena had only heard from the world's greatest sopranos, but with a power and freedom that seemed to violate every principle of vocal strain and technical limitation. Helena found herself leaning forward, her mouth slightly open, watching something that challenged everything she'd spent her career believing about vocal development and training. This wasn't just talent. This wasn't just good technique learned through alternative methods. This was something else entirely, something that suggested possibilities Helena had never considered. Whitney's voice crested at a note so high and pure it seemed to transform the room itself, a sound that carried not just perfect pitch, but spiritual weight, the kind of musical expression that reminded everyone present why they'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Then, with control that defied explanation, she began to descend, weaving the melody into patterns that incorporated elements of gospel, classical, and something entirely original. When she finished, returning to the same middle C where she'd begun, the room remained completely silent for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Helena stared at Whitney with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if she just witnessed something that contradicted fundamental laws of physics. "Where?" Helena asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you learn to do that?" Whitney looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Learn what?" "That range, that control, that—" Helena searched for words that could contain what she just heard. "I've trained singers for 30 years. I've worked with some of the most gifted voices in the world. What you just did shouldn't be possible without decades of systematic training." Whitney shrugged gently, the same casual gesture she might have made if someone had complimented her dress. "I've been singing since I could talk. My mother taught me, and her mother taught her. I guess it's just how we learn in church." Helena walked closer, studying Whitney's face as if looking for some sign of the technical knowledge that could explain what she just witnessed. But the breath support, the resonance placement, the way you maintain tone quality throughout that entire range, those are advanced technical concepts that take years to master. "I don't really think about those things when I sing," Whitney said honestly. "I just listen to what the song needs and try to give it that." "Listen to what?" Helena asked, genuinely confused. Whitney considered the question for a moment, as if it had never occurred to her that other people might not understand. "The music tells you where it wants to go. You just have to get out of your own way and let it happen." Helena had spent her entire career believing that music was a language that could be learned and controlled through study. Whitney was suggesting it was more like breathing, something natural that happened if you stopped thinking long enough to hear what was already there. "But how do you know your voice won't be damaged by attempting those ranges without proper preparation?" Helena asked. Whitney looked at her with the patient kindness of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "The voice knows what it can do. If you trust it and don't force it, it will take you where the music needs to go." For the rest of the evening, Helena found herself in conversation with Whitney, asking questions she'd never asked before. Not about technique or theory, but about the source of music itself, about where musical ideas came from, about whether understanding music intellectually helped or hindered the process of creating it. Whitney never argued with Helena's theories, never defended her approach, never claimed to be better or smarter or more sophisticated. She just answered questions with the same gentle honesty she'd brought to her singing, revealing a depth of musical understanding that transcended everything Helena had learned in conservatories and textbooks. When people began leaving around midnight, Helena approached Clive Davis. "Who is that girl?" she asked. "Whitney Houston," Clive replied with a smile that suggested he knew exactly what Helena had experienced. "Sissy Houston's daughter. I just signed her. That voice is going to change everything." Helena nodded slowly. I've been teaching voice for 30 years, Whitney, she said. I thought I understood what was possible with proper training. She just showed me there are things that can't be taught, only discovered. In the months that followed, Helena found herself teaching differently. Instead of starting with technical exercises, she would sometimes ask students to simply listen, to feel for what the music wanted before analyzing how to achieve it. She never abandoned her rigorous classical training, but she began to understand it as one pathway to musical truth rather than the only pathway. Years later, when Whitney's debut album topped charts worldwide, Helena watched the music video for I Wanna Dance with Somebody in her studio. When Whitney hit those impossible high notes, Helena smiled and shook her head in amazement. That young woman had taught her something that influenced everything she would teach afterward, that the greatest music happened when knowledge and intuition danced together, technical precision serving emotional truth. It was a lesson that could only be taught by someone who embodied it so completely they didn't even know they were teaching. The classical voice teacher had challenged Whitney to prove her technical knowledge. Instead, Whitney had revealed that there were forms of musical intelligence that transcended everything Helena had learned in decades of formal study. Sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who don't even know they're teaching. That night in Clive Davis's penthouse, Helena Morrison learned that true musical mastery isn't about controlling the voice. It's about surrendering to it. Whitney Houston, without trying to prove anything, showed a room full of professionals what happened when technique and soul became one voice. The church girl had hit the octaves. But more than that, she'd revealed that music, at its highest level, isn't something you do. It's something you become.